Hello and welcome. Here are stories making rounds from outside Africa. Moldova's pro-European Party of Action and Solidarity has secured a clear parliamentary majority, a victory that comes amid heated accusations of outside meddling. With nearly all ballots counted, the party captured just over 50% of the vote, widening the gap with the pro-Russian bloc and delivering a decisive boost to President Maia Sandu's campaign to steer the country closer to the European Union. Opposition leader Igor Dundon has rejected the outcome and called for protests with turnout reported as low. Our European capitals welcome the win, while Moscow accused authorities of preventing Moldovans abroad from voting.
In these elections for our country, if Moldovans are strong enough, and despite the massive interference of Russia, will decide for themselves, Moldova will have the chance to continue to strengthen its democracy, to protect its peace, and to continue its EU integration path. If Moldovans will not mobilize enough, and if Russia's interference will impact significantly our elections, then Moldova might lose everything it has won, and this could create significant risks also for other countries like Ukraine, but also the EU countries in the region.
This is the victory of people of Moldova, who demonstrated that their freedom is priceless and their freedom cannot be bought. Their freedom cannot be influenced by Russia propagandas.
A church service in Grand Blanc, Michigan ended in tragedy after a gunman allegedly drove into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, opened fire and set the building on fire. Authorities say the attacker, identified as 40-year-old Thomas Jacob Sanford, was shot dead by police at the scene. The death toll has risen to 4, at least 8 others were wounded. Now, investigators describe the incident as targeted violence with motives still unclear as the FBI assumes command of the probe. Michigan's governor and faith leaders condemned the attack and called for calm as first responders continue to search the fire-damaged sanctuary.
There's a couple additional bodies that we've discovered in the church, so that makes our total victim count up to 4 victims. As I said before, there has already been the suspect who is deceased as well. So we have 5 deceased persons from this tragic incident. Again, our thoughts and prayers go out to the victims of this incident that could have been completely avoided. And it's very tragic, and that's not what our community is.
I can confirm at this time that the FBI is now leading the investigation and is investigating this as an act of targeted violence. FBI crisis response teams, such as our evidence response teams, SWAT, Special Agent Bomb Technicians, victim specialists, were deployed to the scene. We also have special agents who are continuing to conduct interviews and intelligence and professional staff personnel providing research and analysis.
Away from that, there are fresh tensions between Iran and the West after the United Nations reimposed sanctions on Tehran's nuclear and missile programs. Now, Iran has condemned the move as unjustifiable, warning that it will defend its national interests with a firm response. For News Central, senior international correspondent Afua Hagan has more.
Those members of the
Iran is pushing back against the United Nations after sanctions linked to its nuclear program were reimposed overnight. Officials in Tehran have condemned the move as unjustifiable and warned of a strong response. The sanctions, which target Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile activities, came back into force after Western powers triggered the so-called snapback mechanism under the 2015 nuclear deal. Talks aimed at reviving the deal collapsed earlier this year after Israeli and US strikes hit Iranian nuclear sites. But Western leaders insist diplomacy is not dead. The EU's foreign policy chief said sanctions must not mark the end of dialogue, while the US Secretary of State urged Tehran to accept direct talks. Britain, France and Germany stressed their goal remains the same, to stop Iran from ever acquiring a nuclear weapon. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian rejected any talks that he says would create new problems for the country, vowing instead to stand firm and rely on national strength. On the streets of Tehran, the impact is already being felt. The Iranian rial plunged to a record low, with many fearing renewed sanctions will only deepen an already severe economic crisis. The sanctions roll back years of painstaking diplomacy, and while Western leaders say the door remains open, Tehran is making clear it will not be pressured into talks on terms it rejects. With tensions high and Iran's economy under fresh strain, the question now is whether both sides can step back from confrontation or whether the nuclear standoff is entering a new dangerous phase. For News Central, I'm Afua Hagan.
Joining us now to discuss more on this is our senior international correspondent, Afua Hagan. Afua, thank you for joining us. Afua, the UN has reimposed sanctions on Iran a decade after they were lifted. What will be the immediate and medium-term effects on Iran's economy and everyday life under these renewed restrictions?
Well, the immediate effects will be felt on the streets in terms of prices going up. So fuel prices going up and food prices going up. And this is a time where Iran is already facing hard economic times. The dollar is becoming less and less available as well. So those are your kind of immediate effects. In the medium term, inflation will go up, jobs will be squeezed, and then ordinary Iranians will feel the pressure in everyday life more and more and more. Now, Tehran can turn to Russia and to China to try and ease the tensions, to try and get the things that it would usually get from the West. But it can't replace things like the finance and the technology that it would usually get from the West that are now prohibited thanks to those United Nations sanctions.
How have past sanctions reshaped Iran's diplomatic ties with the likes of the United States, Russia, China, and the European Union? And how do you think that these relationships will shift now?
Well, historically, sanctions have done their job. They've reshaped Iran's global alliances, but it's also deepened the mistrust between Tehran and Washington, Tehran and Europe. And it's also pushed Tehran closer to Moscow and Beijing. Like I said, Tehran will now be looking to Russia, to China, to kind of fill the gap that will have been left by the absence of Western finance, Western technology. So with these new measures that were brought in by the UN overnight, we're going to see that divide deepen and sharpen. You've got the Western capitals, so New York, London, cities across Europe, tightening the screws, as it were. And so therefore, Russia and China will step in as lifelines. And therefore, you'll have this split. So you'll have Iran, China, and Russia on one side. You've got the US, Europe, and their allies on the other. And that split makes it much harder to build a united front for Iran.
So, from a diplomatic perspective, have these sanctions historically restrained Iran's nuclear ambitions, or have they pushed Tehran in the opposite direction?
Kind of have a mixed effect. Sanctions helped Iran push towards a 2015 nuclear deal. So it proves that it can get Tehran back to the table. It proves that it can get Tehran to negotiate if they want to. But the pressure has to come with credible initiatives or incentives. And we often see the opposite. So what we see is Tehran deciding to accelerate enrichment as a form of defiance. Look, if you're going to implement sanctions against us, we are going to continue building our nuclear program. So we're going to work more on enrichment, actually doing the opposite of what sanctions want to achieve. So like I said, it has mixed effects.
Afua, what are the likely ripple effects then of renewed sanctions on regional stability in the Middle East and on global energy markets?
Well, this action of sanctions risks raising the tension across the whole of that Gulf region. Iran can decide to retaliate, but probably through its proxies, through its neighbours, and that will spark instability all across the Gulf. And that's not something that we want at the moment, especially with the tensions already, Israel, Gaza, even extending to Qatar, Yemen, all those places as well. On the energy front, as it were, markets react quickly, so prices will spike because of the fears of disrupted oil flows through the region. If you look at the longer term, then sanctions can push buyers to diversify away from Iranian crude oil, and therefore you have a reshaping of global supply lines as people look elsewhere to buy their oil from.
So just to let you go, are sanctions still an effective diplomatic instrument, or are we seeing diminishing returns, as states continue to develop economic and political workarounds?
Sanctions can be effective if they're multifaceted and if they're targeted. They can squeeze an economy, exactly what's happening in Tehran at the moment or across Iran at the moment. It's squeezing that economy. It creates leverage. It might bring Tehran back to the table to negotiate the 2015 nuclear deal or perhaps a new deal. So they can be effective, but it's only effective if sanctions are multifaceted and if they are targeted also.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Afua, for the update. Now, for Africa, the return of sanctions on Iran is more than a distant headline. It forces a deeper look at how similar measures shape lives across our own continent. From Niger's frozen accounts to Sudan's aid bottlenecks, and the real question is whether sanctions solve crises or simply shift the suffering onto ordinary people. And as African governments push back with new rules, especially those on cobalt and lithium, the struggle is not just about survival, but about sovereignty.